Hi, I'm Daniel Eichenbaum. I'm a composer currently residing in West Virginia, and I am the composer of a piece called Gagarin for clarinet and fixed media.
Well, thank you so much. Can you just tell us a little bit about the origin of this piece because it's really interesting.
This piece came about from an electroacoustic performance project I put together while in Kansas City working on my doctorate. A group called Dark Matter, which was a combination of myself, a composer named Richard Johnson, my wife Cheryl Melfi, who's a clarinetist, Rebecca Ash, who's a flute player, and Bob Riddle, who's an astronomer. We got together and created an evening's length performance in a planetarium with 60-foot dome projection system and performing live music with electronics under the dome and featuring, astronomy lectures to go along with that. And for this performance, I wrote Gagarin as an original piece to go with that in celebration of man in space, which we're celebrating 60 years this year.
That's great. And what drew you to Yuri Gagarin's story in particular?
Doing research for Dark Matter, looking at pieces that have a space influence, I found a story that while Gagarin was in space, he sang a Shostakovich tune, Rodina Schlussit, which translates to "The Homeland Hears." And this is a Shostakovich song that was taught to a lot of the Soviet pilots because the lyrics contain cues for landmarks to look for to help guide them home. So this was a common tune that all the Soviet pilots knew. And while Gagarin was in space, apparently he broke into song as the Soviet pilots would, and he was joined by ground crew. And this is the first, although maybe not intentional, but the first actual live broadcast of a musical performance from outer space.
That's incredible. And on Monday, April 12th, so just this past Monday, was what they call Yuri's Night, right? Mm-hmm. And you said that that's the 60th anniversary of that.
Right. This year is 60 years of Gagarin's first flight in space. And he's quite a character. Having done a little research on him, he's, all these old Soviet pilots, they're very short. He's roughly 5 feet tall. And one of the reasons he was chosen was the Soviet officials were asking each pilot, who do you think you should go? Who should go up? Who should be the first person? And all of the Soviet pilots training said Gagarin should be the first person to go. So he apparently made a big splash among his colleagues while training for this program. And it's interesting. There was an NPR story on Gagarin, and the flight of Gagarin was such a shock to the United States that when Kennedy was interviewed about it, did a live TV presentation about that just the night after the flight, he was uncharacteristically lost for words. I mean, the impact of this flight to people worldwide was absolute shock. No one even knew a person could fly in space and survive, and yet here's a guy who flies all the way around the planet and makes it back in one piece.
And that's what makes the Shostakovich Song, especially since it seemed so organic for his flight. It really was sort of he was really hoping to make it home. It was not guaranteed that he was going to come back, right?
Right, and supposedly he was given less than a 50-50 chance of surviving from the rocket blowing up or re-entry or all the other problems that could happen. But he survived. He became world famous as a result, and the space race was on. And as a direct consequence of this flight, the United States government pushes for the moon, to land people on the moon by the 1960s.
And it's really interesting. In your notes to the score, you talk about the electronics and the sounds that you chose for this piece. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose those sounds and what they are?
Sure. I wanted to have some fun with the electronics and make them really reminiscent of that 1960s period. So I was a doctoral student in the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and they had an old Moog synthesizer, non-functional, in one of the side studios. So I took my portable handheld recorder and I started recording myself turning switches and knobs and dials on that. And those are all the switches and knobs sounds that you hear in my piece, Gagarin. The other sounds that I used is I generated just some white noise and I filter it. And by filtering white noise, which is literally every single frequency mixed together, I can pull specific pitches out of there. So I have static bursts, filtered white noise, which gives some interesting pitch drones. I had an old PC desktop computer with a really noisy power supply fan, and that's the sound you hear at the very start of the piece. And a lot of the kind of squirmy sine wave sound in there was just a generated sine wave tone that I started bending. All these things kind of reminiscent of, cockpit noises, radio transmissions. There's not a specific story here, but it's kind of evoking the environment. And the clarinet part, I try to evoke that kind of 1960s broadcast, that ascending fourth and fifth. So that's what the clarinet is doing in the beginning. And then I start to meld in the idea of an interpretation of the Shostakovich tune. And it's really an interplay of these three ideas together that forms the basis of this 5-minute piece.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else about this piece you want to tell us before we listen?
I think this is one of my favorite pieces that I've created because I think it's compact, it's expressive, and it's got this beautiful tune. And when we premiered it at the Gottlieb Planetarium, you have to imagine there was an Earth image with a tiny capsule projected on the screen that must have been almost 40 feet wide, and the tune da 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 comes out by itself, and there's the capsule just floating over that. And I'm imagining from reading about Gagarin is the first person ever to see this image. We didn't really have any good photographs of the Earth from outer space at all. So he's the first person to see that, and you can see in his interviews afterwards, he is a transformed person by this experience.
Well, that's incredible. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and I hope everybody enjoys this piece.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the performance.